fundamental role of government in promoting sustainable and inclusive development is providing essential public goods and services and direct support to households to tackle poverty and inequality. Meeting public expenditure needs require governments to have access to a strong, reliable, and adequate stream of revenues, such as tax revenues. Ensuring adequate government expenditures and tax revenues is a critical element of domestic resource mobilization and central to domestic and international development efforts. With that in mind, we'll be discussing on developing Asia's fiscal landscape and challenges, which is an ADB economics working paper issued in June 2022. Ensuring adequate government expenditures and tax revenue is a critical element of domestic resource mobilization known as DRM. Since the mid 1990s, successive initiatives for heavily indebted poor economies have aimed to ease debt burdens and create fiscal space for government spending. More recently, in 2015, the United Nations Conference on Financing for Development focused on mobilizing financial resources to meet development goals, concluding with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on a sustainable financing strategy. This denotes virtuous cycle of domestic resource mobilization or DRM. DRM can be conceptualized as a virtuous cycle of domestic revenue generation, efficient and effective allocation of domestic resources, and the contribution this makes towards sustainable economic growth and development. This demonstrates tax to gross domestic product ratios during 2000 to 2019. In the 2 decades prior to the onset of COVID in 2020, developing Asia made gradual progress in raising tax revenues. In the period of 2015 to 19, tax to GDP ratio of developing Asia, calculated as a simple average, stood at 16%, up from 14% in 2000 to 2004. Increase in the years just before global financial crisis was particularly pronounced, with further small gains in the years immediately prior to COVID. Tax to GDP ratios also rose in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, albeit more modestly, reaching 16% and 19% respectively by 2015 to 19. Hence, tax revenues in developing Asia were broadly comparable to sub-Saharan Africa, but below Latin America just prior to COVID. In 2015 to 19, tax to GDP ratio for high-income OECD countries stood at 26%, broadly unchanged from 2000 to 2004. Hence, while developing Asia achieved some convergence in tax revenues with OECD countries, They continue to lag well behind, collecting a little more than a third less than OECD countries. This signifies average tax revenues in selected Asian economies during 2000 to 2004 versus 2015 to 19. Across Asia, tax revenues varied considerably. Developing Asia, with the highest tax revenues prior to COVID, were generally similar either to Pacific economies or more advanced developing Asian economies. These include Georgia at 20% of GDP and Fiji at about 23% of GDP. For the Republic of Korea, tax revenues without social security contributions or SSCs stood at 19%, but increases to 27% of GDP once SSCs are included. For these economies, levels of revenue are broadly comparable to the US. Developing Asian economies with the lowest revenues as a percentage of GDP are Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Indonesia, which are at 9%, 11%, and 12% respectively. This shows tax revenue by source. As in other developing regions, developing Asia tend to rely heavily on revenues from value added taxes or VATs, which were widely introduced throughout Asia during 1980s to 90s, and other taxes on goods and services, including exercises. This shows tax to GDP ratio. Despite their large share of total revenues, level of revenue that developing Asian economies generate from VAT and other taxes on goods and services as a percentage of GDP is still lower than OECD countries. Reliance on VAT and other consumption taxes is especially high in some smaller economies, accounting for three quarters or more of total tax revenue in Vanuatu, Vietnam, and Cambodia. This displays in other developing Asian economies, revenues are generally more diversified, with a greater balance between consumption and corporate income taxes. In the vast majority of developing Asia, personal income tax share of revenues is small and in relatively few. It generates revenue greater than 2% of GDP. This indicates tax structure that relies more on direct taxes relative to indirect taxes. Therefore, is generally considered more regressive and less efficient. As is the case in other developing regions, in developing Asia, direct taxes account for a smaller share of revenues than in high income economies. In 2015 to 19, share of direct taxes for developing Asia was about 33.6% compared with 43.7% for OECD countries. This illustrates there is a strong positive correlation between total taxes and spending across developing Asian economies and other economies as well. Given the low average taxes in developing Asia, Excluding the Pacific economies, average public spending of about 27% of GDP is comparable to developing peer regions, but far below OECD countries. This reveals for developing Asia and other economies, tax revenues are more strongly correlated with public spending in areas essential for promoting inclusive development. Indeed, while education, health, and social protection spending rises with tax revenue around the world, higher education and health spending stands out in developing Asia. This shows excluding the Pacific economies, developing Asia's education and health spending lags behind not only OECD countries, but also other developing regions. Average developing Asia spending on social protection compares a little more favorably on developing peers, but is less than a third of the share of OECD countries. Across developing Asia, discretionary fiscal policy response, as announced on budget fiscal measures in the ADB COVID policy database, was invariably large. In many cases, these amounted to 5% or more of GDP, with Fiji, Mongolia, Singapore, and Bhutan unrolling a particularly large set of measures. In almost all economies, packages comprise both tax and spending measures, with the former generally smaller. This denotes change in tax revenues from 2019 to 2020. Large discretionary fiscal policy responses, together with the collapse in economic activity, caused a sharp fall in tax receipts along developing Asia in 2020. These falls were generally correlated with broader economic conditions, with revenues falling further in some small island economies, including Fiji and Maldives, as well as other hard hit economies such as Indonesia, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. This displays change in expenditure from 19 to 20. Significant increases in expenditures were recorded in most developing Asian economies. Consistent with stimulus announcements, limited data suggests health spending rose strongly. For example, rising 15.2% to more than 13.6%, respectively, in the People Republic of China and Indonesia. Weaker revenues and higher spending saw fiscal deficits widen in most economies in the region. On average, from 1.8% of GDP in 2019 to 6.4% of GDP in 2021. Achieving the SDGs by 2030 was estimated to require annual investment of $3 trillion to 4.5 trillion USD, with very little amounts needed in sectors such as energy, climate change mitigation, water and sanitization, education and health, with actual investments of about $1.5 trillion. This implied spending shortfalls of about $2.5 trillion globally. According to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, known as UNESCO 2019, the Asia and Pacific region alone needed to invest an additional $1.5 trillion annually. According to IMF estimates, average estimated spending shortfalls amount to about 9% of GDP for a sample of developing Asian economies. Beyond the near term, governments across developing Asia face vast public spending needs that will require stronger tax revenues, which is why strengthening tax revenues for sustainable development will remain a key policy challenge in the coming decades. Today's presentation is based on Asian Development Bank's economic working paper titled as Developing Asia's Fiscal Landscape and Challenges. Thanks for watching.